Intercultural Communication and Translation, lecture number 14. The theme of the lecture is translation of scientific terms. According to the plan of the lecture, we are going to discuss the following questions. The first, peculiarities of translation of text on science and technology, and the second, the translation of units of the metric system. Nowadays, nearly 70% of translators work with scientific and technical texts. Translation of such kind of literature is widespread and highly demanded. For this reason, an in-depth theoretical study of the specific features of scientific and technical translation is an urgent problem of translation theory. The materials which belong to different fields of knowledge and practice, science and technology, are the object of special translation. The peculiarity of these materials is their exact expression of thoughts, which is achieved by the broad usage of terms. The main types of special translation are the following: scientific, technical, military, legal, and economic translation. In translation of scientific and technical texts, the main task is to identify the idea or situation described in the original. The translator should understand the content in order to translate properly. The predominance of the referential function is a great challenge to the translator, who must have a good command of scientific and technical terms and sufficient understanding of the subject matter to be able to give an adequate description of the situation, even if there is no fully achieved in the original. The translator is also expected to be aware of and follow the stylistic requirements of scientific and technical materials to make text acceptable to the specialists. It is appreciated when translators are aware of the peculiarities of the sphere in which they work. To translate scientific and technical text properly, it is necessary to read scientific and technical literature not only in the source language but also in the target language. That is why translators who work with scientific and technical texts have no specialize in one or two fields of production. Study regular the special literature, be aware of the novelties in this sphere, and use the experience of specialists and highly qualified translators. The text of science and technology have specific lexical means known only to the engineers and scientists working in the particular sphere. On the other hand, engineers who do translates sometimes do not have a good command of foreign languages. Consequently, translation should be done by a professional translator, and then it should be checked by a specialist in a correspondent field of science or technology. The translation of special literature should conform to the standards of the target language. In this genre of translation, there can not be any changes of the fact or of the source language. In the process of the phrase translation, it is important to render a thought as clearly and exactly as possible. The peculiarity of written scientific speech is that texts may contain not only verbal information, but also different formulae, symbols, tables, diagrams. It is mainly typical of the texts of such sciences as mathematics, physics, chemistry. Any translation Any scientific text may contain graphic information. Translating headings in drawings, the latter shouldn't be redrawn, and headings should be written in Russian or Kazakh on the copy. It is also important to point out that translation should be laconic. Description of machines, equipment, instruments, or processes of production should be illustrated in translation. Translation of technical terms is absolutely dependent on the translator's knowledge of the subject matter of the source text. Translators must take great pains to get familiar with the system of the terms in the corresponding sphere and make good use of the terminological dictionaries and other books of reference, as well as online resources. It is necessary to remember that a term is usually translated by a corresponding term of the target language. Such ways of translation as analogues, using synonyms, and descriptive translation are used only when there are no equivalent terms for translation. Terms are relatively content-free language units, though the content often helps to identify the specific field to which the term belongs. As a rule, English scientific and technical terms have their permanent equivalents in their respective Russian or Kazakh terminological systems. For example, heater, нагревательный прибор, alkaline medium, щелочная среда, silicic acid, кремниевая кислота, spherical shell, сферическая оболочка. Many terminological equivalents in the Russian language have been formed from the English term to transcribe or long translation. Container, container, file, file, design, design. Terminology process, possess international units: atom, atom, proton, proton, focus, focus, plus, plus, diode, diode. In some cases, there are parallel forms in Russian. One form by translation or long word, and the other which is usually a native word. For example, эквивалент и равенство, баланс, равновесие, резистор, сопротивление, бустер, ускоритель, индустрия, промышленность, инсталляция, установка. The correct choice is absolutely necessary in this case. From the point of view of the understanding and translation difficulty, terms may be classified into the three groups. The first group, terms denoting realia of other countries. 7 ways of translation are possible: by a Russian Kazakh term, the form of which is connected with a word of an English word, international term; b. by a Russian or Kazakh term, the word of which is not connected with the form of the English term; c. the meaning of multi-word English term has a fully equivalent Russian or Kazakh term; and d. the general meaning of multi-word term coincides with the meaning of the analogous Russian or Kazakh term, but their components are different. The second, terms denoting realia of other countries, but having generally accepted Russian or Kazakh terminological equivalence. The third, terms denoting realia in other countries and not having generally accepted Russian or Kazakh terminological equivalents. Translation of such terms may be done in the following ways. A. Description of an English term. B. Word-for-word translation. C. Partial or full transliteration. D. Transliteration and word-for-word translation. E. Transcription. And F. Transcription and translation. It is necessary to mention that the main mistake in translation of such terms is that translators sometimes try to find a literal equivalent of the English term in Russian or Kazakh materials. Such approach is not completely correct, as it is important to render the specific character of foreign realia. Furthermore, these terms may express concepts typical only of foreign reality, and consequently they may not correspond to the realia accepted in Russian or Kazakh special texts. Translator can also make a mistake as a result of wrong referring of a term to one of the groups mentioned above and choice of the inadequate way of translation. One more translator's mistake is word-for-word translation when an English term or its component are analogous to a Russian or Kazakh terms, but they have another meaning. In translation, it is necessary to take into consideration the meaning of the term in the particular situation and concrete context. It is also necessary to take into account the possible changes of terms' meaning if it is used in the plural form. Thus, correct understanding and translation of terms depend not only on good knowledge of the language, but also on being aware of foreign and Russian and Kazakh realia. For example, the word pocket, the main meaning is karvan, has the following special meanings. В авиации данное слово имеет эквивалент воздушная яма, в военном деле это окружение, в радио это мертвая зона, в геологии это гнездо месторождения, и в электротехнике это кабельный канал. And there are a lot of such terms in scientific texts. All the English and American measures should be transformed into metric equivalents. There are some groups, linear measure, which use the following metric equivalents: mile, yard, foot, inch, мили, ярды, футы, дюймы. These metric equivalents are absent in Russian or Kazakh scientific text, and they will translate it as kilometers and centimeters. The next group, square measures. Квадратные мили, акры, квадратные ярды и квадратные футы. In Russian or Kazakh, they will be translated as square kilometers, square meters. Квадратные метры, квадратные километры. The next group of metric equivalents are cubic measures. In English and Russian empirical system are used the following: register tone, cubic yard, cubic foot, cubic inch, кубические ярды, кубические футы, кубические дюймы. So in Russian or Kazakh they will be translated in cubic meters, кубические метры, сантиметры и так далее. So weight measures, tone, hundredweight, stone, pound, ounce, grain. unte, unции, funte, stone, tonne. So they will be translated into Russian or Kazakh with kilograms, grams. So measures of capacity are used in American and British system are used the following: gallon, quart, pint. And in Russian or Kazakh it will be measured in liters. Temperature. Prefixes are not as commonly used with temperature measurement as they are with those for weight, length, and volume. The following can be used as general guidelines to tell the weather in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. В русском и казахском языках используется система измерения температуры Цельсия, градусы Цельсия. В американской системе используется температура в Фаренгейтах. To convert degrees Fahrenheit to the Celsius, multiply by 5 ninth after subtracting 32. To convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, multiply by 9/5 and then add 32. The translation of units of the metric system and other will depend on their setting and their implied readership. Thus, in translation, newspaper and periodical articles into English, they are normally convened to the so-called imperial system, система измерения британская, miles, pints, pounds. In translating specialized articles, professional magazines, they are usually transferred. The metric system is retained, but for cookery articles, they are both transferred and converted into the metrical imperial system. For fiction, the decision whether to convert or transfer depends on the importance of retaining local color. There are following ways of translating scientific terms. The first is direct borrowing. Borrowing is categorized into direct and indirect borrowing. Direct borrowing consists of native words in donor language, whereas indirect borrowing comprises words borrowed through donor language. Native words are those which can be etymologically traced back to the most primitive phase of that language, even though direct borrowing is becoming the increasingly common terminology translation procedure. The next method is calc or loan translation. In calc or loan translation procedure, the lexical components of the source term is translated, then arranged in the target language in an order similar or nearby similar to that of the lexical component of the source term. The next way is literal translation. Literal translation tends to occur when the set of semantic components and the set of lexical components coincide. This especially takes place when the source term consists of Latin lexical components queuing in an order similar to that of the lexical components of the Russian or Kazakh term. The next method is transposition. Transposition entails the grammatical changes but no semantic changes. It is the change in syntax from the source term to its translation. The next method is modulation. Modulation as a type of transposition or at the global level implies two categories of thoughts, not grammatical categories. And the last one is adaptation. Adaptation is the search for the terms equivalent in the target language based on its set of semantic component as a whole, rather than translation each semantic or lexical component of the term. To sum up, the quality of scientific and technical text translation is highly affected by several factors. First, translators' knowledge of the scientific speech style, both in the source language and target language. The second, ability to choose corresponding equivalents in the target language, taking into consideration their functional and stylistical peculiarities. And the third one, general translation skills. Thank you very much for your attention.